Good evening. Welcome to our next step on our walking tour through the Bible. And we're looking at chapter 40 onwards of the book of Genesis, the Joseph tale. That's what I'd call it, a tale. It's not history, it's a story that is meant to be instructive. So, what we'd call in English a tale. Now, it's got several characteristics, this tale, which are rather surprising. First of all, like a lot of tales, sometimes the tales we tell to children, it's got some really horrible bits to it. So, for example, Joseph is in jail and he interprets the dreams of two of Pharaoh's servants, the cupbearer, who is going to be restored to favour, and the chief baker, who is going to be hanged, and the birds are going to peck at his corpse. That's pretty horrible. That's much worse than the wicked stepmother in Snow White, I think you'll agree. So I remember as a small child reading this in my children's Bible thinking, oh dear, that doesn't sound good at all. Anyway, there was elements of horror and elements of, if you like, of niceness, of prosperity. Joseph has misfortunes, but they soon turned into good fortunes. So it's sort of cyclical. No matter how much he's knocked down, he always comes back again, and he just rises and rises and rises. He ends up in jail. He's made the head of the jail. He then is forgotten about in jail, but luckily he's remembered in due course, and then he's promoted by Pharaoh, and in fact he becomes the chief man of Egypt. He becomes sort of, if you like, the prime minister. And one of the things that, therefore, Joseph does is he emerges as a hero, a rather strange sort of hero, not the sort of normal hero you'd have today. So Joseph says to Pharaoh, when he talks about the 7 years of plenty and the 7 years of famine, Pharaoh should now find someone intelligent, i.e. like Joseph, and wise, like Joseph, to govern Egypt. Pharaoh should take action and appoint supervisors for the country and impose a tax of 1/5 on Egypt during the 7 years of plenty. They will collect all the food produced during these good years that are coming and store the grain under Pharaoh's authority, putting it in the towns and keeping it. This food will form a reserve for the country against the 7 years of famine which are coming on Egypt, so that the country will not be destroyed by the famine. So that's 41:33 to 36. In other words, Joseph puts himself forward as a manager. Now, the word manager is not particularly glamorous in modern speak. We think of, oh, he's a good manager, he's a safe pair of hands. But one's got to realize that for most people on earth, even today, but certainly historically, the idea of having good administration was the nearest thing to paradise they could imagine. Most countries were chronically ill administered. And here is Joseph putting forward a plan for the administration of Egypt so the country is not destroyed by famine. Now, countries were historically destroyed by famine. Even nowadays, famine can cause change of governments and civil unrest. So Joseph is setting out a wonderful plan which involves foresight, planning, organization, all those wonderful things that we despise so much. He is intelligent and he is wise. That's to say, he knows how to use his intelligence properly. In this, he is like King Solomon, who he foreshadows King Solomon, that wise ruler who was a great administrator of God's earthly household. If you remember, King Solomon had all those horses, each one of which was fed on time, whereas, of course, in many a country, a horse goes hungry, indeed people go hungry. So Joseph is put forward as a superb administrator, a wise man, a good, wise administrator. So he's the first wise man to be put forward in the Bible. And so we admire him. We're meant to admire him. Now, God has not put us in charge of Egypt, has he? He's not made us chief vizier to the Pharaoh, but God has put us in charge of ourselves and our own households. He's put all of us who are adults in charge of our own money, in charge of looking after our dwelling places, in charge of looking after animals entrusted to our care, in charge of looking after children entrusted to our care, in charge of looking after old people entrusted to our care, in charge of administering our worldly goods. So when you go bankrupt or when you run out of money or when you get into debt, it's because you're not being like Joseph. You're being rather, well, like yourself, I suppose. We are called to be responsible. Joseph takes responsibility for the people of Egypt and as a result, the people of Egypt are saved. So responsibility is a sort of virtue that in fact gives a life to thousands and thousands, millions of people. We need to be more responsible. Irresponsible people do great harm in the world. They do things which have disastrous consequences for themselves, but more importantly for other people. That's how wars start. Somebody decides to start a war, then they walk away from the situation they've created and they leave other people to pick up the pieces. Joseph is somebody who makes sure there's no pieces to be picked up in the end. So that's the first thing about Joseph. He is meant to be admired. The other thing of this story is telling us is a providential story. Joseph is there, sold into slavery, mistreated, but eventually coming out triumphant so that he can save the chosen people. He can save his brothers. And right at the end of the Joseph cycle, we're told that it was just for this reason that Joseph was sold into slavery, so he could save his brothers from death. I am your brother Joseph, he says, when he reveals himself, whom you sold into Egypt. But now, do not grieve, do not reproach yourselves for having sold me, since God sent me before you to preserve your lives. For this is the second year, etc. There's been famine in the country. Chapter 45, verse 5. So in other words, all the bad things that happened to Joseph happened so that a great good might come out, the salvation of the chosen people. This small family of 670 people that belongs to Jacob. And Jacob then comes down into Egypt. There's a third thing about this story which is rather important, and that is it explains to us how the chosen people got to Egypt in the first place. They got to Egypt as honored guests, not slaves. They were later made slaves, but they started off as honored guests. So in other words, this idea that the Israelites were a bunch of runaway slaves and no good people, etc., etc., is completely false. They were in fact settled in the fat of the land, given the very best territory, and were appreciated by their Egyptian hosts when they were first invited in. So therefore, it's a story that, if you like, raises the self-esteem of the chosen people. You know, we were slaves in Egypt, but originally we were invited guests, we were honored guests. And finally, there's something else I have to tell you, and that is, if you look at chapter 47, verse 13 onwards, you'll discover something that is probably historical and which is also not very nice. And this explains why the Egyptians were serfs. There was a famine, the Egyptians needed food, so they essentially mortgaged themselves to Pharaoh. And they gave their money to Pharaoh for food, they gave their land to Pharaoh, and then he gave it back to them and allowed them to work it as serfs, because it was that or starvation. In other words, by hoarding the food, if we can call it that, rather than storing it, and by controlling the food supply, Pharaoh, through Joseph, reduces the people of Egypt to serfdom. Now, this is extremely interesting, this passage, because we know from historical sources that the Egyptian peasants were in fact serfs at that time under the pharaohs. And also we know that later on, under the kings of Israel, such as Rehoboam, they were also serfs, and they were subjected to forced labor, which drove them to revolt. And of course, the serfdom that is inflicted on the Egyptians through the agency of Joseph is later inflicted on the Israelites themselves. So I think that's probably quite historical, that bit there. And it's also it casts Joseph in a rather bad light, which I think, therefore, usually Joseph is seen as in a wonderfully good light. Here he's seen in a bad light. And therefore, that's probably something that is actually a historical fact that has crept into the story. And also explains why Egypt was the country it was, a country of serfs, a country of forced labor, where the ordinary people were little better than slaves. And no wonder, therefore, that the Israelites left it. So the stage is now set for the book of Exodus. We've finished Genesis. We're making good progress. Bye for now.